Hi, welcome to the CIDCI online salon series. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the CIDCI Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you here today. CIDCI's mission is to accelerate innovation, disruption, and change to improve the built environment. We create networks that share knowledge, experience, and ideas through productive dialogue. CIDCI is a not-for-profit organization that relies on your financial support to provide for these programs. Many of you have received a renewal invoice to continue your support this year. Please respond as generously as you can. As we enter the second month of 2021, it may feel like we've lived an entire year already. Americans have intimately explored the meaning of words like sedition, insurrection, impeachment, and intubation. Despite this past month of history-making events, we all still rise every morning to help our kids connect with online learning, make a daily call to a parent or elder, and wonder what to make for dinner. Life continues, our work continues, and design and construction continues. And from these most historic times, there have been and will continue to be opportunities for change and innovation, not just in how we make things, but how we work together. Our hope is that through this tumult, we can rise together to make a better built environment, more equitable, efficient, sustainable, and beautiful. Now more than ever, please mask up, wash your hands, and stay home, and be kind. Take care of yourself and those around you. Okay, here's a bit of information about how today's session will work. We're recording this presentation and we'll place it on the CIDCI website as soon as possible. If you have questions or comments during the presentation, please use the chat box. We'll take as many questions as we can. You can raise your hand or put the question in the chat box. Today's session is scheduled to run for about 60 minutes. Our presentation is entitled Creating High Performance and Innovative Cultures with Employee Ownership. Tom Redl, the executive chair of Chandos Construction and a Canadian IPD leader, has created a culture of innovation at his company with employee ownership, purpose-driven principles, and socially responsible practices. He's going to explain how employee ownership has transformed one of Canada's most successful construction companies. There's a lot we can all learn from our Canadian friends. Welcome, Tom.
Great, thanks, Margie. Good morning, everyone. So I understand we have most of our participants would be in the US, but a fair contingent from Canada. So to my fellow Canadians, hi everybody, and people from other countries as well. So looking forward to chatting with you, hearing some feedback. And if anybody wants to follow up, we can do that. We can do that as well. So I'm going to talk about employee ownership, and Margie talked about the title. We'll expand a bit beyond that because a lot of it, employee ownership, is part of a context and part of a whole system of things that work together. But I would just want to have a quick preface before I jump in, and I'll be putting up my slide deck shortly. There's many approaches to employee ownership, and as a matter of fact, I've been with our company for 24 years. Our company is 40 years old this year, and we're on our fourth structure already. And I laid awake for about 15 years trying to figure out how employee ownership worked. And we actually changed our structure a few times, as I mentioned. And I think the structure we have in place now is, I think we've pretty much nailed it for us. Doesn't mean it's for everybody, but it's working really well for us. And it's been in place for about a decade now. I've worked with a lot of companies over the years. People have come to us and wanted to talk about employee ownership. Usually, a primary motivator is founder succession or other forms of ownership succession. Sometimes it's golden handcuffs. Sometimes it's about how to attract and retain people. And quite often, some people come out of frustration saying, I want to look at employee ownership because I want my employees to think and behave like owners. And one of the things I want to talk about, through this, you'll see that employee ownership is a means, it's not an end. So with that, I'm going to start to share my screen. So I want to talk about the Chandos system. So for lack of a better term, employee ownership is really the core to it, but it's a system. It's a set of interrelated activities to achieve certain outcomes. So as I mentioned, it's the means, it's not the end. And I'm going to have to talk about values and purpose, because employee ownership is really a method of implementation values and purpose to achieve certain outcomes. So to understand why we built our system the way we have, I need to kind of back up and talk a little bit about the why. So our agenda today, I'm going to talk about my why for a couple of minutes just to let you know why I've got a lot of passion around this topic and organization structures that are made this way. I'm going to talk a bit about business challenges of today, because really it's about business and business challenges that we have in our environment today in North America. They can either be quite problematic for business, but they can also be quite opportune. And then I'll talk about the mechanics of our employee ownership. And then I'll wrap up in terms of how that connects into strategy, governance, and leadership of an organization. So I'm going to start with my why. And just to give you some background on me, I grew up on a farm on the prairies in Saskatchewan, if everybody knows where that is, in Canada. So my family upbringing, my father was always a farmer, but he also always had another job. So he worked endlessly, very extremely hardworking man. And when I was around 12 years old, he moved from being an employee to starting a business. And the business was a good business. And the transformation I saw for both my father and our family was quite profound. And it wasn't just about money and being able to make a decent living as a business owner. It was about the challenges, the ups and downs, but really what it did for his identity and how he felt about himself. So work. So if we put so much time into work and how that work develops us as human beings, I think is really quite significant, because as time goes on, people aren't going to need to work as much as they have in the past, just with affluence in our society. So the work has got to be coming with a little bit of meaning as opposed to just economic necessity. So there was two things that really sat with me. One is just the dignity of work. People who work really hard. I've got a tremendous amount of respect for people who pack a lunch pail and go to a construction site every day. A lot of stuff happens, and a lot of our jobs exist because of that. So dignity of work is number one. And then secondly is the impact that business ownership and partnership can have on individuals and on families. So that's why I've got a lot of passion around this topic. And I've always believed that business can be used as a force for good and developmental purposes. It's not just about the economics. So I'm going to move on and talk about these challenges. So this is a little bit of a sidebar. These are trends that are significant on the stage of business today. And, the rise of the purpose-driven organization is, the negative version of that is all the talk around capitalism is failing. The relationship between society and business is a little bit strained. And purpose-driven organizations are really becoming key to performance in organizations. So that would be a whole session on itself. I'm not going to expand, but there's been, in the last decade, particularly since the crash in 2008, there's been many books, many articles, much research on how the economic system of capitalism is just not performing well or meeting the expectations of society. Diversity and inclusion, that's popping up in all sorts of areas, and it can be more specific geographically, but really, it's not just hitting the news a lot, but there are, issues relating to not having proper diversity and inclusion practices in your businesses, and but there's also opportunities with having proper diversity and inclusion practices, which I'll expand on later. Adaptability. So that's kind of a blanket term. And, I believe that long-term, the businesses that do well and survive are the ones that can be most adaptable. We see agile, coming up as a buzzword a lot. The fact is the rate of change of the environment is accelerating, and a business's ability to adapt to changing conditions is becoming paramount to not just thriving, but surviving. And then the last one is the modern workforce. I'm a boomer. I'm the tail end of the baby boomers, and I hear a lot of my friends sitting around complaining about the millennials, and they want purpose or meaning. Well, the fact of the matter is, that's the millennials are starting to take over the world, and the generations behind them. But it's not specifically about millennials. The millennials get tagged a lot on that, but the modern workforce wants not just a paycheck. They want meaning, they want purpose, they want to be part of an organization that makes a difference. And that's not only a factor of retaining them, it's a factor of motivating them. And one of the biggest issues that business has today in North American society is productivity. And if you want the modern workforce to be productive, you need to get with the program. So as I talk about these different parts of employee ownership, just keep these in the back of your mind, and you'll see how the system that we've built takes into consideration these business challenges and changes them from being problems to competitive advantages. So I'm going to jump into what our strategy is. It's a true strategy, not bolt-on. Now, when I say true strategy, it's a set of activities that are interrelated and mutually reinforcing. So I'll just give you an example. So corporate social responsibility. A lot of companies have been doing it. If you run your business and you run a good business, and then you have a CSR or corporate social responsibility initiative, maybe it's giving back to charity. It's kind of you do your business, you make your money in your community, and then you give back. That's a bolt-on. That's an afterthought. It's not part of the strategy. If doing good becomes part of your strategy, it makes your business stronger and it's integral to your strategy, that's mutually reinforcing. So that's the difference there. I just wanted to define that term for you. The other thing that our strategic initiatives and business practices really try to focus on is find the ones that are rooted in values. And I'll give you some examples later, is that the things that are consistent and congruent with our values tend to get done. The things that aren't tend to not get done. It's that simple. And the other one is assumptions lead to actions. Now that gets to our belief systems, and I'm not being judgmental about that. It's just that different people have different belief systems. So for example, this crowd would be quite well versed in IPD, and we know in IPD practices that not all firms and not all people are cut out for IPD, and that's fine. It's just just understanding the reality of that situation. But if people have assumptions that the people on, like if somebody who's in the lead of a project has an assumption that intelligence is hierarchical and the people on the site don't have anything to contribute, they're probably not a good candidate for IPD. But if somebody believes that the people on site, have a brain and their thought process and their ideas are respected, that's where IPD comes to life, because you get that collaborative atmosphere. And some people naturally collaborate and some people don't. It's just, if that's a belief system, or whatever your belief system is, just make sure that you're operating with in activities that are consistent with it. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. I'm going to talk a bit about the continuum of employee ownership or business ownership. Kind of at the left side, which is not what we're talking about. I just put that there to contrast. You might have private equity or public companies that are represented by a few people. So it's kind of high concentration of ownership. At the far end, you may have ownership that is passive, not involved in the business. And then as you move over, you might have an owner operator, a proprietor. Then you may have what I would call key employee owned or executive owned. That's what Chandos was when I joined the company about 24 years ago. I was shareholder number 7. It was effectively a partnership. There were 7 of us. And then over time, we've expanded, and today we have about 200 owners in our company. Now, we're not at the far end of that spectrum. So when I was designing this and working on the principles and the structure, over 10 years ago, I was looking for different models. And one of the models I studied was a company called Mondragon. That's Mondragon. And they're out of the Basque region of Spain. You can Google them, lots of information. Their tagline is "Humanity at Work," and they're an incredible company. They are an employee-owned co-op, so they would be right at the extreme right. They've been an economic powerhouse, a massively successful business. I think today they've got about 80,000 employees on 150 companies that operate in 50 countries. So massively successful, and they're very much a democratic organization. Like the CEO is elected. Every single employee owns a share, and they've got this whole system built around that. So in studying that, I actually went to visit them, and I had aspirations that Chandos in its ideal form would be an employee-owned co-op like a Mondragon, and that was what I was pursuing. But I learned something really important when I went there. The organization structure of Mondragon is congruent with the values of the Basque people. So it's their society values, and it's again an organization that is consistent with a set of values. And the Basque people are a collective society. They are there for each other. North America is more of an individualistic. People work hard to get ahead. And so it's based more on common good than individual pursuit of dreams or the American dream. And it's actually quite similar to North American indigenous culture, which is very communal oriented. So again, there's no judgment there. It's just, understand what it is and build the system to be congruent with the value set. So what I learned when I went to visit Mondragon in Spain was that's probably not the best solution for a North American society. So if you move over a little bit, you have the US ESOP. We don't have those in Canada. It's a legislated form of corporation that is employee owned. So we sit a little bit, I've got the yellow star where I would put us, and we are what I would call a meritocracy. So we're employee owned. I'll get into the mechanics of it in terms of how that ownership works, but we are a meritocracy. We have hierarchy, we have executives, we're competitive, and we are not a democracy. So if you look at the spectrum, I'm just trying to get you oriented. And at the beginning, my preface was that there are a lot of ways of approaching employee ownership. I'm not getting into corporate structures or tax strategies or anything here. I'm just getting into kind of the philosophy and the structures of who and how and how the ownership mechanisms work. So that's the spectrum. And again, it's important to understand, if anybody's ever looking at employee ownership, what their reasons are. Like, they can be ideological. If you have egalitarian belief systems, that would take you in one direction. If it's just about ownership succession, that can take you another direction. If you think about our ownership succession journey, I'm kind of at an interesting point. When I started 24 years ago, I took the lead in the succession of the first generation of ownership, and the ownership of the company became more fragmented. And now we're most of the way through our ownership and leadership succession to our third generation. We're passing the torch on, and the equity and the leadership of the company to the third generation. So I've kind of seen the front end of it and now going through the tail end of it. So it's come full circle, and I'm seeing the whole cycle of ownership and life cycle of a generation of leadership. So I'm going to get into the mechanics of it. So I'm not going to read through all of these things, but anybody can own. If you're with the company for a year and you're not on the verge of getting fired, you'll get an offer to buy some stock in the company. The other key factor of ours, which is quite different than most structures, is there's one class of shares. So a construction a construction laborer or receptionist would have the same shares as a CEO or myself as executive chair. But the quantity is a function of performance and responsibility. So the higher your performance, the faster you would get offers to buy into your position. And every time you move up on hierarchy, there's your opportunity to own more increases. So it's roughly multiple of 2 every time you go up a notch in the org chart. We have a lifetime maximum per position. So this is where we would depart from the people with the money are the people that can make more money. So this helps to avoid kind of concentration of ownership on the top end of the org chart. So for example, as CEO for many years, I was only allowed to own a certain amount of the company. So and so the executives who would own more of the company would get more of the profits, so they'd be in the best position to buy even more. Well, we limit out, so that forces, the natural tendency would be a migration of concentration of ownership to the top of the org chart. This kind of is a limiting factor on that. So that's the lifetime maximum per person. People can buy in over 5 years. Sometimes if we're recruiting a key employee, it's a really good recruiting tool. We could have somebody limit up immediately, or so equity for really key or brand name employees is a good recruiting tool. But our people also buy a fair market value. There's no gifts. There's skin in the game, and people have to write a check to buy our shares. And however, if they want to really get some skin in the game and they want to get in a little deeper, we can make financing available to leverage up the purchase. And the last feature is that the unit holder agreement is there to protect the company, not there to protect the individuals, and we're very clear about that. So we work for the company. So in some smaller businesses or owner-managed businesses, the business is really there to work for the owner. In Chandos, it's very clear. So even as CEO and as CEO, I had definitely not a controlling interest in the company, but a larger interest than the other employees because it's a meritocracy. It was very clear that I worked for the company. And so that if you think about terms of servant leadership and being there to develop people and what your mission is, it's very clear that we are employees serving the mission of the organization. So I'm going to go through our statement of intent. So I'm just going to hit some high points. The key here is that it's on one page, and boards of directors in different companies, you would often hear that a board of directors is there to act in the best interest of the shareholders. Our board of directors signs off to a statement of intent, and it acts to a set of intentions. So I call that values-based governance. And a couple of the key terms in there is, it's about our work, and I'm going to expand on this, but our work is very, very much of who we are, and it's got a quality of life aspect to it. We've got to run a strong business, capital subordinate to people. I'll expand on that. And I'll go through these in a little bit more detail. So we'll start with the purpose of work. The purpose of work is, basically growth and enrichment of people. There's a financial aspect to it, but there's another key that you can just read this, but there's a key word there: industrious. We're not an organization for lazy people. We are competitive. For this whole system to work, we need to play to win. And people who are hardworking have that right. People who don't want to imply themselves or have other interests, again, there's no judgment. It's just, call a spade a spade. But productivity and contribution is key to the success of a business. And if the business is not successful, the system doesn't work. So, strong business. We're fiercely competitive. We're free enterprise, and we have a goal to discover and deliver more value than other builders. So we play to win. But if you talk about the notion of innovation, discover and deliver, that is innovation. And so innovation is actually not, something you should do because it's new and cool. It's something that is an imperative of the organization. It's a responsibility of the organization to fulfill its purpose. Our employee ownership, as I mentioned, available to everybody. And again, I've talked about this. It's a meritocracy. This notion here is a little bit more, I'll call it economic philosophical. The role of capital in our system is to be a resource to enable opportunity. So if you think about the traditional view of capitalism, people who own, so the capital in the system exists, in our system, the capital in the system exists to serve the people. In a normal capitalist system, the people who have the capital own the company, and the humans work for the company. Therefore, the humans are working for, of course, the owners. But if the people who are working in the company are the owners of the company, it kind of turns that thing on its head. So some people say, well, you're not a capitalist business. I said, well, I guess we're not a capitalist business in terms of the pure economic sense, but we are a competitive free enterprise organization. So sometimes people have a little trouble getting their head around that, but it's really the essence of employee ownership is that when we are there, if you think about what you want from the company, you have to think about what you want for yourself and your fellow shareholders. Teamwork. This is interesting in that, collaboration is a real buzzword these days. And, I'm talking to, the collaboration crowd here on this session. And it's not for everybody. And it's not just, something we do when we go to a meeting. It's actually a way of operating. Like it's the way we relate to each other. And I think our value of collaboration. It's not a practice, it's a value, which is built into our DNA. I think that's why we've done well at IPD. We've established a leadership position, and some companies just they really struggle with IPD. And I believe it's because if it's, as I mentioned before, if it's incongruent with your values, you're going to have a hard time executing it as a business practice or a tactic. Strategy. So, Michael Porter, a strategy guru from Harvard, he really talks about it as a set of mutually reinforcing activities to create an advantage over competition. The key, again, is mutually reinforcing activities. And the strategy that gets done is rooted in core values and assumptions. So that's actually the bottom one is actually me. I'm basically saying that. I couldn't find any quotes on that, but as I've talked about that, that's really important, I think. So I'm going to give you an example now. So this is something a lot of you would have seen. Jim Collins, one of my favorite books ever. He wrote about something called the flywheel in Good to Great. And it was about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, he wrote another, it's like a mini book, which is kind of rewriting the chapter on the flywheel. And we worked on that, and we looked at it in terms of how does that connect to our business, and what example would we have of how it relates to how we create the culture of innovation in the organization. So we came up with a set of reinforcing activities that, again, is an explanation of how strategy needs to be mutually reinforcing. So we started with the notion that we all belong. We have kind of this open admission value that everybody can come to the party, everybody can contribute, and how well you do is up to your skills and how hard you want to work. So we all belong. So it's a very inclusive environment. So we actually come at diversity inclusion through inclusion before diversity. So we need to create the environment. But then we see diversity not as something to do because you're supposed to do it, but diversity is a better way of collaborating. If you have good collaborative practices, and if you have people with diverse views, there's ample evidence to suggest that you're going to produce higher quality decisions. And then through those decisions, if we create ideas. So we have a tagline: we see things differently. Like, how do you see things differently? Well, you need to have the ideas. You need to have the different perspectives, which comes from diversity, and that is ingenuity. Now we separate ingenuity from innovation. Ingenuities are the ideas. The world is full of ideas, but most of them don't get implemented. And in between ingenuity and innovation, we have to create a culture that is psychologically safe. So the environment has to be psychologically safe. There's a lot of talk about psych safety these days. There's a book called The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. That's been out a lot, but really it's about people who are afraid if they make a mistake and they get pounced on in their organization, or they get fired, they won't take chances, so they won't innovate. So the key to the culture of innovation is psychological safety. That creates innovation, which is the implementation of the ideas that come from these collaborative practices with diverse people, and that helps to deliver value to customers and grow the business to bring more people into the belonging of the business. So if you think about how that spins on itself, that would be an example of mutually reinforcing activities that can create a flywheel. So I'm going to move to, so these are sets of words. I'm not going to kind of go through this in a lot of detail, but you can see if I could draw a bunch of lines in between these, and there would be a whole bunch of lines because there's multiple connection points. It's not a series or a flow. It's, again, mutually reinforcing. If you look at continuous improvement, IPD, of course, I'm talking to the IPD crowd here and the lean crowd. You can see how it is a manifestation or an expression of the sets of values. And that's why I believe it's worked well for us. And I'll give you one example. So we know that in lean, there's various ways of approaching lean. When we were earlier on our lean journey, we tried a couple of what I'll call two camps. One is the, say black belt, Sigma, flow process, do the Kaizen thing and kind of look at the whole process and try and find out how to eliminate waste. Another one is go to the ground level and, go to a worker on a construction site and challenge everybody to find some way to save 2 seconds on your job today. 2-second lean. A guy named Paul Akers wrote a book called 2-Second Lean. We worked with him. And the 2-second lean worked well for us. The Kaizen approach just didn't seem to have as much energy. Now, if you connect that back to our values and our assumptions, you can see why. So thought leadership, we have taken the lead, not in developing and educating just ourselves, but other organizations, our industry. And really that goes into topics such as social procurement, which I know you've talked about before on these webinars, and also, just community connections, and also advancing, the various ways of business that can be used as a force for good, which is, part of the B Corp certification, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the Certified B Corporation, for those who don't know, when we joined the B Corp movement, there was about 2,000 B Corps in about 50 countries. Now there's about 3,700 B Corps in 74 countries around the world. It is a global thing. And what it is it's a third-party certification that you are a socially responsible business or that your company has a social impact. You can Google Certified B Corp and see there's a whole bunch of stuff there. They'll even talk to you about what is measured, what parts of the business is measured. This is not to be confused with what's called a beneficial corporation. Some jurisdictions have a legal form of beneficial corporation. They do get confused. They're different, but you can be a beneficial corporation as a B Corp and vice versa, but they're different. What B Corp is to corporate social responsibility is what LEED is to environmental sustainability. Like a lot of people would say, hey, I'm building a great environmentally efficient building and I'm being good and treating the environment well. Well, who says? Well, I say. So how do you demonstrate that you're really doing it? There is a need for third-party certification. So B Corp is to social responsibility as LEED is to environmental sustainability. Some B Corps that you would know, Patagonia is a B Corp, Ben & Jerry's is a B Corp, New Belgium Brewery is a B Corp. So there's a lot of companies that you would know. If anybody's interested in pursuing Certified B Corporation, you can check that out. And it's a brand, and for some customers, that brand matters. That brand has been instrumental in us getting some projects. So again, it's what society is looking for from business, which is coming through what customers are looking for business. And if you address that, it's good for business. So if you look at our employee structure, so these are things I've talked about already. Now, if you just put them up against each other, it's not, you would have a bunch of multiple lines. It's not a flow like A leads to B and B leads to C and C leads to D. It's a bunch of things that work together. That's why I call it a systems approach. You can't like map out individual flows in it, but they're groups of things that just really work well together and create some synergistic effects. I'm going to talk now about governance. So how do you oversee these organizations to keep them on track? One would be through the mode of governance. So the term ESG has been coming up a lot lately. The term a few years ago was more CSR, corporate social responsibility. Now ESG, environmental, social, and governance. The notion of governance and responsibility of governing bodies is becoming more and more important. So we have a kind of a best practices board, and we've worked with a few companies in helping them establish these boards, because a lot of best practices in governance for boards of directors is tailored around public companies and is more watchdoggy. It's born out of Sarbanes-Oxley and a bunch of people doing naughty things. In private businesses, you want your governance to have some checks and balances, but you also want it to add value and be not just preserve value or be a risk mitigating entity. You want your governance structure to help you with your strategy and help you with your competitiveness. But the governing body represents all owners. And so executives can be owners, but also rank and file employees can be owners. The board represents everybody. We use governance best practices. We have the committee structure. There's kind of a whole bunch of stuff. That would be a whole session in itself as to how to build governance in employee-owned companies. And then one thing that a lot of people ask about is, how do you manage executive compensation? Well, we have a compensation policy. We have a compensation committee, which is comprised of independent directors who are professional directors in other companies, and we use data-driven approaches to establishing executive compensation to ensure that it is consistent with the compensation policy for the company. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, but there is this independent body that represents all the owners. So that's kind of gives you kind of the whole loop around the top to the bottom of the organization. So to conclude, I always say it's important, if you're looking at employee ownership, to avoid prescriptions. Prescriptions are, this is the way you do employee ownership. Well, it depends. It depends on what you want, and make sure you understand, as I said, it's a means to achieving what you want. It's not the end. Employee ownership, not for the sake of employee ownership. It's like culture. Like if we want to have a great culture, well, why? It's because it is intended and designed to create certain outcomes. So you have to back up into your values to understand what it is that you want to accomplish with your business. Strategy is key. I've talked ad nauseum about that, about how these things have to work together. And so for this crowd, I came up with a new term, integrated business delivery, which is really, it's a holistic approach, and it's a design approach to building a business, as opposed to just saying, our customers want this, we're going to do this. It's more comprehensive. It includes what customers want. It includes a relationship with your community and society. It includes what employees want. It addresses some of the key challenges of business today, which gets to business sustainability. Businesses that don't survive, that's problematic. So it wraps all these things together, multiple stakeholders, into the overall design of the company. And the other thing, it's similar to IPD in terms of how you build a building, except it's never finished. The company is never finished because the environment keeps shifting and changing. So it's like a perpetual IPD exercise. So that's my talk. So we'll put it up for discussion or questions. If anybody has any questions, I'll just throw this out here now. I'll stop my share.
Hey, anyone who'd like to add questions, feel free to add them in the chat box, and I will unmute you, and you can ask a question directly to Tom, okay? I'm going to start with Annie Corver.
Hey, Tom, it's Annie Corver here. It's really nice to meet you. I just had a quick question for you. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was really inspiring. I was wondering more, I'm always keen on those lessons learned, right? And I mean, I really, I value that you've been working through this for 25 years and it's been a journey, but as you go along, I guess lessons learned, like if you would have gone left instead of right, or if you could recommend to us, gosh, don't make that mistake, go this route instead, anything like that?
Yeah, I'll give you one. So a lot of people, I mentioned this briefly, a lot of people come to me and say, hey, I want to do employee ownership. And they come because they're frustrated. And it's because I'm tired of my people, I'm working really hard in my business and I want my employees to think like owners. And I as I mentioned, I laid awake at night for many years trying to understand, what does employee ownership mean to the owners, to the employees? And the lesson I learned is it means different things to different people. And the answer I've come up with experience, the lesson I've learned is that if employees really will just think like true entrepreneurs and owners, they wouldn't be working for you. They'd have their own business. So you're not going to flip a switch, give somebody some shares in the company or sell somebody some shares in the company, and they're instantly going to become this highly motivated entrepreneur working day and night to serve your business. It's not going to happen. The behaviors are ingrained. So that would be a lesson learned, that you don't give somebody a share in a company, flip a switch, and all of a sudden they turn into this this entrepreneurial person. Is that what you're looking for, Annie?
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant. And you had some opening comments, Tom, about Indigenous communities, and as an Indigenous Canadian, I think that's the place I'm coming from. And I made the mistake of first going to my lawyers with this, and they just looked at me with like I had four eyes, like, what are you talking about? Like building a community inside your company. They just wanted to talk about revenue. And I was trying to drive the creation of shared value within the firm. But anyways, thanks, Tom.
Where are you in Canada, Annie?
I live in Calgary. I'm on Treaty 7 territory, and I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta.
Yeah, I'm Métis as well. And that's a very, if you want, we can connect later, but that's an extremely interesting topic about how IPD principles and how values-based governance and organizations like this, how those values resonate with certain communities. And I think there's an extremely strong connection point with Indigenous communities and this methodology of building a business. So there's some great stuff there. We've actually done some work exploring it on that. So if you want to follow up with me, you can send me an email and we can chat further.
Great, thank you.
We have a question here from Adam Temple. So Adam, I'm gonna unmute you and allow you to ask your question.
Hello, good morning, Tom. Just
Morning.
curious if becoming a B Corp helped you in other ways that you weren't expecting. Like, did it, enforce different policies that you didn't have before, or kind of push you to create new ones? Yes.
So that's a great question. So the B Corp exercise is wonderful. So and I would encourage anybody, whether you want to be a B Corp or not, to look at the B Corp checklist, because what it did for us is, puffing our chests out saying, yes, we're a socially responsible business, and we do all this, we're employee owned, and we have all this stuff. And then you go to the B Corp and you say, oh, this is interesting. It's an expression of who we already are. So a lot of people that become B Corp say, oh, it's really who we already were. We just didn't know what to call it. So then you become a B Corp. But what it did is when you go through the scoring exercise and you go through this big, long checklist, you start saying, maybe we're not so good. Like, we could do better here. We could do better there. Oh, I never thought about that. And it's a great tool. So if you want to use business as a force for good, it's an excellent tool, the best tool I think out there, to help you do even better. And then so now we have a score, and now we've identified all the things we can do better to improve our score, because we're competitive. And now we have a checklist, and we have initiatives around implementing things in our business to improve our B Corp score, which makes our business better and makes us more responsible. So it's really, really good. And it illuminates blind spots and gives you checklist areas to think about you may not have thought about, and build on the great things you already have doing.
Cool.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom.
We also have a question here from Kurian Tharakon, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name, Kurian.
Hi, Tom. I know there are multiple, millions of variations of how you can end up with an employee ownership structure, but is there an overall roadmap that you could recommend to us, even if it's in a book form or a diagram, that would give us a starting point for all the considerations that we would have to go through? Like, even up, like you answered one of them right away, like independent executive compensation, a board where it sets a compensation. But what would be an overall roadmap that you could point us to, if any?
Yes. So I think, there's a saying in IPD, it's and some of these thoughts are actually direct parallels with IPD process, culture before contracts. And so the roadmap, I can tell you what to not do, what a lot of people do. A lot of people say, oh, how do you do employee ownership? And then you go to, you read a book and says, okay, this is how you do employee ownership. Here's the mechanisms, or you go to a lawyer and say, I want to do employee ownership. Let's start with unanimous shareholders agreement. And then you get into this debate about a unanimous shareholders agreement. And I'll just share you a quick story. One of my first jobs when I joined as shareholder number 7 was to redo the 20-year-old unanimous shareholders agreement. It took me 3 years, and everybody had their own lawyer, and everybody's trying to figure out what's fair. And The problem with that is that you've got a bunch of people acting in self-interest and you're trying to reconcile differences. The way we handle our shareholder agreement now that everybody signs is we sit down and say, you know what, this is not here for you. You can take it to your lawyer and your lawyer will tell you that it protects the company, doesn't protect you. And I say, I signed it, everybody signs it. So that's the deal. And, you know, that exercise, you know, that I did 20 years ago that took 3 years to do, trying to reconcile all these differences, I don't think I've spent more than 30 minutes talking to, you know, hundreds and hundreds of employee owners in the last decade about the shareholders, the shareholders agreement, because it's that quick. So the point I'm making is understand the intentions first and then design the system later. So you've got to start with, you know, what's your why? Like, what do you want to accomplish with your organization? You know, if you look at the spectrum of competitiveness or the spectrum of impact, you know, where do you sit on that and get a good handle on that, and then design the organization, design the ownership program, and look at your ability to design culture and the things you do to achieve those goals. And then you get into your contract forms and your structures and how that works. But you know, it's easy to say, but it, you know, it takes a while because it's a custom build.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from JP Marks. So JP, I just unmuted you if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, Tom. Good morning.
Morning, JP.
Thanks for the presentation. Yeah, one question for you here. Well, I got a couple, but I'll start with one. You mentioned it's a means to an end. It's outcome driven. So you've put a lot of time into this transformation. You said you've seen it go through 3 generations. So what's the evidence of the outcomes, and what metrics do you have for measuring its success and the value of that effort?
Okay, so first, when I talk about these generations, this is kind of leadership transitions, which, you know, represent equity in the business, but it's more a function of leadership. Every year, approximately, I don't know, probably 5 to 7% of our company changes hands every single year, and it's seamless. That's why I love this system now. You know, if I look at, you know, when I was CEO, you know, so back when we were kind of owned by executives, it's like, you know, who's the chosen one, who's retiring, and that person sells their shares to another person, and, you know, and then what happens if you don't like that person the next day, and, oh, I made a mistake. Like it's real. That was really, really cumbersome and just a tremendous drain in energy. The way it works now is there's a system, there's a grid, and it's management driven. Management recommend their owners, and every year we'll transfer 5 to 7% of the ownership. And when I was CEO, my entire time commitment for that entire exercise to go through that ownership transfer would be maybe half an hour, like very, very seamless, structure driven, which was really nice. So, you know, so that's the ownership. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Just sort of what metrics you use to measure the success of the outcomes.
Well, yeah. So profitability is a metric. So we benchmark. Now we're a private company, so the data is not readily available. But you know, we talk to, you know, the financial people in our industry. We get business valuation. So the value of our shares is an outcome, and how much money they make, how much money they make for our employee owners, how the company performs. We try and benchmark against other organizations. So there's financial performance. We're looking at doing an environmental impact report. So there'd be environmental responsibility metrics. We're working on those. Social impact. We're starting to do some more work on that through social procurement, community benefit agreements. So impact reporting is a little tougher than financial reporting, but we're starting to get more and more down that road, but still have a ways to go. So yeah, very, very metric driven, but you know, it's financial and impact.
What about employee engagement metrics?
Yeah, so we're working with that. We're using employee surveys, so it's kind of a bottom up. And yeah, so we're developing metrics. We started that about a year ago. I wouldn't say we have a great database or that it's refined, but that is work in progress. Because again, you know, engagement and how that connects to productivity, really important, but you know, sometimes tough to measure.
Interesting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from Dean Reed, who's a member of the CIDCI board. Dean, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Tom. This is a great eye-opening conversation. My question is, what would you tell leaders of companies, maybe in the second or third generation of that company, that is closely held, limited owners pool, who are listening to this talk and thinking, my goodness, this seems like a much better approach to increasing employee engagement, experience, and innovation.
Okay, so this would be to the leadership?
Yes.
Maybe I'll relate a similar organization. So with respect to employee ownership and how that connects into what you just said, I think you need to back up to the purpose of the organization. And the fact of the matter is, if it's a family-owned business, or if it's closely held, or sometimes there's a business that's owned by a third generation of a family and they're really not involved, they have professional managers, and the purpose of that business is to generate cash flow for the descendants of the founder. Well, it is what it is, right? And if it's there as a cash cow, and the reinvestment, the desire for reinvestment or investment into innovation, or the belief system of the ownership group is not congruent with the type of practices I'm talking about, then it's, call a spade a spade. You might have trouble. You probably will have trouble. You only have so much room to move, but if the purpose of the organization is simply to generate next year's cash flow for a group of passive owners, like, you have to understand what you're dealing with. And I've had some conversations with people like that, like president of a company that took over from a founder, and this gentleman is very frustrated because the founder, didn't want to reinvest, was a little tough in dealing with, and wanted to lay on a beach and have the check sent to him. And I said, well, he owns a company, so again, there's no judgment. You can have your company do whatever you want, but you just have to understand what that is.
So Tom, what I was more thinking about is there are a lot of employee-owned companies in the U.S.,
Yes.
But the ownership pool is relatively small compared to the size of the organization.
Yes.
Maybe an organization of thousands, but there's just a few hundred owners at most.
Yes.
And so what I'm really asking is, what would you say to those people who, are, yes, need the income for sure, but they're not the original founders. They're
Yes.
part of that employee ownership, but who really see that it is limited, and there are two classes of people. In other words, they're caught maybe someplace where you were early in the evolution at Chandos.
Yes. Okay, so that's where we were, and when I started, it was what I would say key employee owned, not broad based. There are a lot of good arguments for key employee ownership. So we're becoming more fragmented over time, but we're fairly far down the road in our journey. That's okay. Like, if you're looking at it as a compensation tool, there are other compensation tools. There's long-term incentive programs, there's phantom shares, there's a lot of structures. And key employee-owned organizations work. There's some people argue and make good arguments that the only people that should own shares in the business are the people that are in positions where they can move the needle on the business. So it's a different approach. But I would, to answer your question, I think whatever your structure is, it's got to be a mechanism to implicate what you want to do, or basically to execute on what you want to do. But I would go back to kind of those core business issues from a business leadership perspective. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world that we have to deal with as business leaders in terms of those four things I talked about. When there's a lot of stuff there, if you're going to be leading a business, you need to be sustainable, you need to be profitable, you need to be competitive, and there's a lot of dynamics. So what I would suggest is look to those things and make sure that you're winning and doing what you need to win and getting people engaged to do that for you. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. Jerry Pohl has a question. I'm going to unmute you now, Jerry, if you want to ask your question directly.
Perfect. Yeah, just a quick question here in regards to having equity ownership in relation to voting or decision making. Does the share ownership come with any proportionate decision making? So at what level does an employee's ownership also include voting or decision making as one of those minority owners? Or is that role dependent?
Yeah, so that's part of the governance structure. So one share is one vote, and there's only one class of shares, as I mentioned. And at every year, the shareholders vote in the board of directors, and the board of directors, as a collective authority, no individual director has any authority. They only have authority as a group. The CEO reports to the board. So awesome. It would be, similar to a public company that way.
Sweet, thank you.
Now there's certain things, like if you want to sell the company, you need super majority. You have to go to the shareholders for like big deals, like selling the company or something, which has never happened.
Are you able to share what you mentioned the limit, the lifetime max? Are you able to share what sort of percent of the company is? Is that 5? Is that 45%? Like, I'm curious order of magnitude.
Yes. So it's driven by scale. Okay. So just order of magnitude, like, the founding CEO would have owned about half the company. The second generation CEO would own about a quarter. Third generation would own about a tenth. I would expect the fourth generation CEO would own about a 20th of the company. As the company gets big, 1 or 2% actually is significant.
Yeah, it's a smaller piece of a larger pie rather than a larger piece of a small pie, which is, yes. I think that's the real exciting part about this is you're tapping into the minds of many, and you've got 200 people. Maybe they're not flipping the switch as entrepreneurs, but they're definitely switching their philosophy.
Yes, you got it.
Sweet.
I'm going to take one last question from David McAngus, who was actually the first person to ask a call. So David, I'm going to unmute you and go ahead and ask your question, then I'll wrap it up.
What was the biggest personal challenge you had in trying to drive the culture? Many people I know, they want to mature in business to take over the company, and yours was different. So I'm curious as to what that biggest personal challenge was in order to embrace it.
I think the whole notion, so this would be kind of how my view on this has changed. When I joined, I was, in my mid 30s, and I was out to conquer the world, and I was mid 30s, and I just wanted to go make a bunch of money and grow a business and have fun. And, thinking about employee ownership really as a financial mechanism, that's where I found out at the end of the day, I was so wrong. And it's about belonging. It's about respect. It's about being listened to. So when we started getting into like 2-second lean and really truly respecting and our frontline workers and what they could bring to the table, and turning the table and saying, these are the people who know what they're doing, and they're the ones that are going to make a difference, and almost just kind of letting go and letting them do that. That built culture, built performance, contributed to results. And how much of that is actually about, technically being a financial owner, it's not the biggest thing. It's about that respect, psychological safety, and people's ability to contribute. And when they want to, and when they have the ability to contribute, and they have the safe environment to do that, and the people come and lead, they come up with great ideas, and they do great work. Like, I can't even keep up with the work that our people are doing.
Fantastic.
And so I'm just become a fan, as opposed more of a fan than a leader.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, I would say that you're probably more than that. I would say you're an evangelist in the best possible use of that word. So we can't thank you enough. This was so inspiring, such a great way to sort of begin 2021 with new ideas, which can really reshape the world and how we do work. So thank you so much. If people want to get in touch with you, do you want to shoot your email in the chat box maybe? Or do you have a preferred way for people to follow up with you?
That email's fine. Okay. It's just Tredl at chandos.com.
Great. Okay, well, this concludes CIDCI's online salon. The session, as I said earlier, will be recorded and placed on the CIDCI website in the next couple days. To join us for future webinars, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website, cidci.org. Join us on February 19th for Grace Farms' director, Sharon Prince, and she's going to discuss a movement called Design for Freedom, the new movement to remove slavery in the building materials supply chain. Special thanks to Monica Whistler for keeping us on track, and especially to Tom for world-shaking ideas in a time when we need them most. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.